All right. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Pugh Hall, the home of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. My name is Dr. Teresa Cornacchione, and I serve as the instructional assistant professor here, and I'm delighted to serve as a faculty advisor to the Bob Graham Center Student Fellows, the sponsor of tonight's event. All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Pugh Hall. Is that how I sound? Oh no, that's devastating. All right. The Bob Graham Center was founded in 2006 to facilitate civic engagement and public service among the UF community. During this, our 20th year, we aim to continue to honor his legacy for providing quality public programming. Indeed, this program tonight represents that goal, facilitating a conversation about the intersection of communications, engagement, and politics. I hope you are as excited as I am to hear from such accomplished Gator grads. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Jacob Kaplan. Jacob is a second-year political science and economics student and is a member of the Bob Graham Center Student Fellows. Please welcome Jacob to the stage.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. C, and thank you to the panelists for joining us today for the Navigating Political Media panel. I am Jacob Kaplan, a fellow at the Bob Graham Center for Public Service and your moderator for this evening. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Before we start, I'd like to ask everyone to please silence their devices. Our panel will be 30 minutes, starting with some brief introductions. Then panelists will have a few minutes to answer each individual and group question before we conclude with audience questions. If you're watching from home, please use the chat feature on YouTube Live to ask your questions remotely. Now I have the honor of introducing our panelists. Bianca Barrios is a public affairs associate at Cornerstone Government Affairs and a double Gator with a master's in political science and government. Previously, Bianca worked at Sachs Media after serving as a speechwriting intern at the White House in the office of the First Lady of the United States. Andy Shodell holds a master's of science in strategic communication from Columbia University and works as an account executive at Sachs Media. During his undergrad at UF, he served as a communications assistant at the Bob Graham Center and was editor-in-chief of the Florida Political Review. Elliot Trudeau serves as the Gainesville Sun's local government reporter. He graduated from UF's College of Journalism and Communications in 2023 and has previously worked for WUFT News. He has won awards for his various projects documenting the aftermath of Hurricane Ian and investigating fertilizer's impact on our environment. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Now we will begin with questions for each of our panelists. We will start with a question for Bianca. At Cornerstone, you work with a team to provide communications support for various clients. What do you consider when strategizing a client's political messaging?
Sorry, figuring this mic out. Hi, everyone. So, like Jacob said, I work at Cornerstone Government Affairs. We are a lobbying and public affairs firm in DC, and we're one of the only bipartisan ones, which is really nice. What we consider when we're talking about taking on a new client and what the client's issue is really just a little bit of everything. So when we come on with a new client, we figure out what it is exactly that they do, what they don't do, what their issue is, who are they advocating? Are they advocating the Hill? Are they advocating the White House, DOD, DOJ? And then who are the key players here? So even if we're talking about advocating to DOD, are we talking about Secretary Hegseth? Are we talking about the Joint Chiefs? Are we talking about the Secretary of the Army, Marines, etc.? All of these things are really important to take into consideration because it changes the messaging, of course. So if we are talking to Secretary Hegseth about expanding, let's say, women in the military or DEI programs in the military, that's a very different message than talking to Secretary Hegseth about expanding fitness requirements or expanding funding for DOD. So all of these things, the stakeholder mapping, what the ask is, what the player that we're talking to is, what their history, partisanship is, messaging is, it all comes into play when we're figuring out what the best path forward for the client is. And then we talk about who's the best messenger for this. So with the Secretary of Hacks example, do we want our story on the New York Times or do we want it on Fox News? Do we want it on Newsmax? These are all considerations that are very important with getting the client's message across, because as I was telling Elliot earlier, politics really is just about who can tell the better story. So it's really important to make sure that your messaging is right and the person that you're talking to really connects to that message more so than anyone else that is just hearing the message at broad.
Thank you for that insight. The next question is for Andy. As an undergraduate at UF, you worked in speechwriting and political journalism. In what ways have these experiences helped you transition into your graduate work and current role at Sachs?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so when I was an undergrad at UF, I was a speechwriting intern for President Fox, which I did through the Graham Center, actually. Spent a lot of time here where you guys are sitting right now. And one of the concerns that I personally had when I started that role was thinking about the ethics of speechwriting. When you hear that a public figure gave a really big speech and you find out after they had nothing to do with actually writing it, you might think, how is that ethical? Why do these people get away with not writing the things that they're telling people? And that's where you kind of want to peel back the curtain on what it means to do communications and what political media, what purposes political media serves in the first place. And with speechwriting, you have these huge public figures, individuals who are well known across the world, and they do roles that might be in public service, like elected official who is representing their district every day in Congress. You have CEOs of corporations who are selling whatever it is that might be their bottom line that they have to hit for their company. And if these individuals were to have to sit in front of a screen with no words on it, a blank page in the middle of the day and be like, okay, I have this speech next week. What am I going to write? That takes away from their actual role of serving the public or serving their stakeholders, whoever it might be. So the job of a political media professional is to think, okay, we're serving this person and this goal of the office. What are the best possible words that this individual might want to say to the public that can accomplish their goal? And you want to find words that are even better than what they could find on their own, because that CEO is not a writer. That elected official might be a doctor or someone else. They're not a writer. So that's where we step in. You want to find out how to match people's voices. So that's the first part of what I'd say is really valuable about the speechwriting field. And even if it's just for a friend, working with them, like, let me see the speech that you're about to give, can be really helpful to think through what are the best words that this person might want to share with the public in a way that they, as a writer, might not be able to put together. And so that's also how you can see that speechwriting isn't necessarily an unethical profession. We're helping the service goals of the offices that we work with. And you also mentioned journalism in the question. Journalism allows you to really boil down a lot of information into what people need to hear and structure your arguments well. I was editor-in-chief of the Florida Political Review through the Graham Center as well, and had a lot of experience, which was kind of a first time for me with more professional type journalism, learning the actual steps and the process of how to put together an article, how to fact check, what it means to follow AP style. And all of those details are really valuable in political communications as well, whether or not you're working for that corporate CEO or an elected official's office or wherever you end up in the field of political media.
Thank you. Now our final question is for Elliot. In the past decade, the journalism industry has faced shortened attention spans and a rapid online news cycle. How do you approach these challenges when reporting on local politics to balance accuracy, speed, and interest?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, Jacob, and to my panelists here as well for the invitation and to be speaking on this here. From your point, though, so I'm a local government reporter with the Gainesville Sun. I'm a graduate here at the University of Florida, so I worked at WFT. I actually did Morning Edition. I did All Things Considered. I was actually a former breaking news editor for the Alligator as well. So through that, like Andy said, like there's things that you had to learn about, like AP style, and learn about the ethics of journalism from there. Now with me, I get to actually practice that because I am a journalist and I get to interview people. With that being said, though, hyper-local news is something that is important because there's issues that information that no other outlet can get to. Even though I'm under the umbrella of USA Today, there's things that Gainesville residents can't go to. For example, like what's going on with GRU versus what's going on with the city of certain things. So some people even come to me in general, like if they can't go to their, if they can't even go to their they feel like they can't go to a lawyer, they can't go to the police, they can't go to city, they come to me. And kind of like, again, like Andy said, like the most important thing is for us to make sure all voices are being heard. So to go on with the question for engagement and a local thing, I think it's also to understand like, understanding what's happening on a national scale, but also seeing how it happens on a local scale as well. What's a big example of that right now? Gas prices. Gas prices is something that everybody's being affected by. So one thing I have to kind of figure out in the general is how do I go about and how this affect people in general? We go on Gas Betty. What is it like in High Springs to Alachua to Micanopy to Gainesville itself? They go to us for that certain information, other outlets. But I would say to kind of answer your question more, I would say is that tackling topics that no one else can get to, like University of Florida reporting. Obviously they go to other outlets, but they also come to us from there. But also like national topics, like how is it affecting you as well? So I would have those things.
Thank you for that perspective. Now we will offer some general questions to all our panelists. Firstly, in the past 5 years, AI has become an increasingly popular tool in both journalism and PR. In what ways has AI changed the way you approach your work, and has it created any challenges? Bianca, we'll begin with you.
I think as any writer will tell you, probably the hardest part is just getting a word on that page. So I think for me, AI has been incredibly helpful in just kind of getting over that barrier, where I think people say, oh, well, if AI can write anything, then what is the point of a writer? I think that comes into the heart and soul that you can offer as a human being and your perspective on the issue. AI can write very fancy words, but when we're talking about conveying people's stories, conveying an issue that is affecting Americans, it's affecting constituents, it's affecting whoever, there needs to be a human to tell that story in honor to pay respect to the people who are trying to say that story and just get people to understand and connect with it. So I think AI for me has been a great barrier of getting something on paper and kind of mapping out my thoughts. Where I come in from there is the humanness of it. This is not just a story about, for example, a woman who went to the gas pump and had, an incredible price to pay. This is a story about maybe a single mother who had to pick between filling up her car with gas or buying groceries or paying for her kids' daycare or whatever it is. I think there's a humanness that we bring into it that can never be replaced by AI. And I think in understanding that, we can, instead of being scared of AI, just use it as a tool to refine and to get over that hurdle of maybe just not understanding or not being able to put that first pen to paper.
Thank you. Andy or Elliot, you guys want to add?
I'll hop in briefly. So I was in the Master of Science in Strategic Communication at Columbia. That's where I pursued my master's. And while I was there, AI was completely banned. You were not allowed to use artificial intelligence on any assignment. This was like 2023 to 24. And they would run all of our assignments through those checkers to see if you'd used AI and mark you down. The semester after I leave, they incorporate classes, welcoming AI, encouraging it, forcing you to use it, and now there are no rules against using AI in your classes. So obviously everyone is catching up to this cultural shift. It's a new technology. A lot of people don't know how to use it. And that's why where Bianca and I work now, or where we worked together before Bianca went to her new role at Cornerstone. I'm an account executive at Sachs Media, where she used to work. We have weekly Wednesday trainings for AI, where one of the partners at the firm will analyze a lot of the new trends in artificial intelligence and try to teach us the best ways to use them for public relations. And so as people grow to learn how to use AI, I definitely recommend trying to adjust to that and adapt it into the work that you do. I've been learning Claude, whatever you call it. The first time I used it was like 2 weeks ago. I had been using ChatGPT before that. So you can teach old and young dogs new tricks, but you can't over rely on it, obviously. And we've seen the issues happen with hallucinations getting into final drafts that then we review, like Elliot mentioned, like, the importance of facts and articles. That stuff can't happen. And when people do their own research, it doesn't happen. But when people over rely on AI, it has a higher risk of happening.
kind of going, there you go. Third time's a charm. Going off from that, so with AI, we follow a policy with USA Today as well, and it's emerging technology. We're getting used to it as well. While AI is something that I mostly use for something like, for example, like I have an auditory processing disorder. So sometimes if I'm able to process information, if I'm reading a legal document, I'm like, I don't know what this means. What does this mean? And sometimes in general, disability or not, there's legal jargon. I have no idea what they're talking about. So what do? If I have also, if I'm on a deadline, I have something going on, there is a way where I can kind of, if I'm looking at a court case, I can kind of analyze it from there and see what this means from there. With that being said, though, it's still a tool that we're getting used to, but it's something that we still adhere to by the guidelines. And it's something that we might help for, understanding, maybe what might help for me to understand and summarizing something. And sometimes I'll be honest, I'll read something, I'm like, I'm not quite get that from there. So it'll take a couple of times. So I know that's more of a specific example of AI, but like I said, we're still, we're very strict about the policy. We're making sure that it's verified. We're making sure that we're here because, our panelists said, you need something factual and human.
Thank you, everyone. On to our second question. Social media has become a primary platform for audiences, journalists, agencies, and public officials to communicate. What role does social media play in your professional work? Andy, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Social media is very important to public relations, and I'd say political communications as a whole, because there are so many people who spend so much of their time on social media platforms. Similar to AI, it is relatively new compared to a lot of older technologies, like print newspapers are older than AI, and you'll still find people in the communications field that know better how to pitch to a newspaper publication than to put out an effective post that can reach more people on social media. Not to put down print newspapers at all. They're fantastic ways to get news. They definitely require a lot of attention from political communications professionals. But that should be paired with a social media strategy that can elevate those messages to other people who might not be getting the newspaper every morning and instead spend their time scrolling.
Yeah, go ahead.
To kind of go off on that, interesting point about that. So with my thing about AI, again, to kind of jump off on that point, don't really use AI on a daily basis, but what I do use on a daily basis is social media. And even when it comes to for example, if there's a shooting or there's something that happens with law enforcement, I check Facebook. It sounds weird, but I noticed that Facebook is something that a lot of politicians or even agencies use in general, because that's how the word gets out. And I use that because I get a ding if I look into that, and so that's how I get my news sometimes. If I get alerts on anything, social media is important, and obviously with how we show off our stories, that's important too, because people are going online more nowadays. So I would say that social media plays a part from there, whether how people get their news, but also how journalists are finding the news in general as well. So I guess in short, it's a two-way street.
I think specifically if we're talking about DC, I always say DC is kind of like a high school, and instead of having a cafeteria gossip sesh, people go to Twitter and people get their news from there. I think the social media really has become everything, because every year we're hearing more and more that Americans are getting their news from Twitter or from TikTok or any sort of online platform. So for us, especially for our clients, it is so important that we are monitoring the conversations around our issues on social media, that we are running to social media whenever we need to hear what the breaking news is. I mean, like Elliot was saying, a lot of reporters get their information from social media and then verify it, and that's how it goes into the story, because you don't always have the time to wait for someone to put out a press release or a statement, etc. Social media is so important for our clients. That's how we get to figure out what the public really thinks about us, about our issue. That's where we really get to have that temperature check on how anyone is feeling about anything at any given point. So for us, for our clients, it's monumental to be on top of social media, to have a social media presence, and also just to have somewhere that people can refer to so that we can control our narrative. For our clients specifically, we always put out statements on Twitter and then obviously send it through the official channels, because we don't want something to happen to a client and then everyone be talking about it on Twitter and we don't have a stake in that game. We don't have a voice in that conversation. So it's so important for shaping our narrative, getting a pulse check on how everyone's feeling about us, and then just getting the good old gossip and knowing what the town is saying.
Thank you for that insight. On to our next question. How has your professional experience influenced the way you navigate political content or journalism as a consumer? Elliot, if you'd like to go first.
Sure, and to kind of go off on that, it's basically kind of like how, as basically like off the clock, how I perceive the media from there. I would say through my career and even as a student, because even though I'm 26, I'm still understanding the nature of the beast. I would say that I kind of got used to like, AP style. Like I was taught like Associated Press is like, in a way, like, that's what you should look up to from there, because that is the embodiment of it. But I started to really look into more, I would say, as I kind of report more, understand how like I talk to or from how other journalists are getting their news. Sometimes I look at other journalists on YouTube and see what they're saying or what they can or can't say, and who they're working for, they're working by themselves or not, what are they providing, what are they saying, are they able to expand upon stories, can they not, what can they do personally versus what they can do professionally, I would say, from there. So to kind of answer your question, I would say basically like, I would say kind of like while I'm being used to like, I don't want to say like, older media or like a newspaper, stuff like that, but about like how, for myself, like using both mediums in a different way. Like I guess like how newer technology with older technology and trying to find both, I would say. So to answer your question, I would say how to find a big mix of both, I would say, if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
I think for me, working in media has really changed how I view traditional media. So I know at the White House and at the firm I work at now, we always have the quad screen TVs that has like CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and because we have a lot of older men in the office, it's always ESPN or sports betting. But it's so interesting to compare the coverage in all of these different channels. And I think it really puts into perspective that idea that politics is won by who tells a better story. Because you can go, I remember this very clearly a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you guys saw the snowball fights in New York after the blizzard. And Fox News is saying, someone threw snowballs at police officers and Mamdani endorsed it, so Mamdani hates police officers. And then CNN is saying police officers can't take a joke and they can't take, the snowballs being pelted at them. And it's the exact same story. A lot of the times it's a no story. I mean, we're talking about snowballs. But it's so interesting to see how those things are being framed. And it helps you understand the state of politics today and why we are where we are today, when all of these people are consuming strictly their medium and not understanding that a lot of it is not necessarily the factual, objective truth. It's just how the TV you're watching is telling you that story. To me, it has made me a lot more moderate than I used to be, because I see that on both sides. I see the way that different things are being sold to different people. And I think to me, it was a good reminder in fact checking and checking myself and understanding, do I believe this because it's what I'm seeing on the news, or it's because what my favorite influencer is telling me, or do I believe it because I actually looked into it and I actually researched it myself?
Yeah, 100%. And it's also great to remember that not all press is reported on by an investigative journalist seeing something happening, showing up to the scene of the crime, and finding the story themselves. There is a whole world of public relations and communications professionals who are pitching stories to the press in order to share what's happening with those media outlets, because it just doesn't make sense that journalists themselves can know everything happening at once. Sometimes those stories are pitched with an agenda where someone thinks, oh, we want to pass this bill or succeed on this campaign that we're running, and we have this really negative piece of information we gathered about someone that is on the other side of this issue. And then they'll call up the media or email them oftentimes and let them know this story, which is if you can fact check it and it's undeniable, then of course it'll be published. But that is a lot of the media that we see today. There are great investigative pieces that happen, but you also need to keep an eye out for when pieces are placed by someone who might have an agenda. A lot of the time, placed pieces are not meant to sway people one way or another. Like for an example, this week coming up on this Thursday, one of my clients is working with a local law enforcement agency, and we're announcing that they're going to become the first law enforcement agency in the country ever to have organ donation themed badges, encouraging people to register as organ, eye, and tissue donors. We can have that press conference, and if you do it without reaching out to the press and letting people know this is something that we're announcing, no one's going to come. So in addition to actually speaking with people to make something like that happen, you need to also reach out to the press to get that story pitched. That's an example of a positive, well-intentioned piece that can be in the press. But that's not every piece that will appear. So you definitely need to read things with a grain of salt and try to decipher between what does have a positive intention and what might not have such a good intention.
Thank you, everyone. Now we'll move on to our final question. What advice would you give to those in our audience today who are interested in pursuing a career in political media? Bianca, we can begin with you.
Oh gosh. To me, it is just educate yourself as much as possible. I think UF for politics is the greatest school in the country, and I mean that wholeheartedly. I learned so much here, both inside of the classroom and outside of the classroom. Obviously, inside the classroom, I learned theory, and I learned history, and I learned the practice of being a public servant. But outside of the classroom, you learn a lot of skills that are equally as important in politics. I'm talking about the soft skills of making connections, building a network, building a reputation for yourself, being nice to everyone because you don't know who's going to be the head of whatever the next day. Those are all things that have served me so well in Washington that I haven't really seen other schools emphasize as much as UF does. So I truly think being as educated as possible, taking all of the opportunities that are granted to you here at the Swamp, because there are so many, you get out of it what you put into it 100%. That is going to go a long way. You're going to be surprised if you go to DC or you work in local government, how many people work with these issues day in and day out and don't really know a lot about them. So take this as your opportunity to find mentors, build a relationship, learn from different perspectives, learn about different issues, and that's going to serve you so, so well when you're actually in the political arena and you're one of the only people that gets to say, I have experience in that, or I know somebody that works there. That, to me, is the most valuable thing that UF taught me, and it's the one thing I emphasize to all of the Gator grads.
Elliot or Andy?
Yeah, I kind of bouncing off of that point, I would say read. I think reading is very important. I think even if there's things you read something that doesn't agree with you or something that's very opinionated, why are they coming off from that perspective? Where are they coming from? What are the political aisle you lean on? And it kind of bounced on my point from yesterday and from like our panelists here. It's kind of like tying this all together. It's like at the University of Florida, we were taught, and I was taught by a professor who, won Pulitzer Prizes for reporting with AP and for Wall Street Journal, and who's gone to cover big stories in the past, like breaking the news that Hillary Clinton's emails, for example. And then that's somebody who was my professor at UF, it was like, wow, I get to learn from that and go from there. But with that being said, while being a Gator, I think communing a Gator, pardon the dad joke, is important is because you're obviously they do a fantastic job of putting out in the real world, because you get the real world experience. Because I was on Morning Edition, All Things Considered. I was on NPR. I was on the local ESPN station. I was on the Alligator. I was on NPR in college when there was like a couple of big hurricanes that happened here. I was able to tell the nation what was going on here, what was a big deal going on from that, and again, it's just sticking to the facts and telling you who, what, why, where, and how is important here. So to go on from there, I think being a University of Florida graduate, looking back, I think not only do you talk to a lot of people, but you also I think really get a great real world experience. And again, I'm just the guy from down the street at the Gainesville Sun, and I'm getting that. So anything that applies to here can probably happen anywhere around the country and the world. So I think it's important to always read and to always, look in, make sure that you're reading, and it's important that it's great to be a Gator.
Seconding everything that Bianca and Elliot said, all these opportunities are at UF, right in front of you. The Graham Center is an incredible place to go if you know that you want to get involved, but you might not be sure how. The Independent Alligator breaks stories, quite frequently that have national importance to people. And all of this happens at this university, but it's easy to forget that it's happening right in front of us because we're here. Sometimes it feels a little bit like a bubble. We have our classes and our schedules, but it really does have a lot of national salience, the work that goes on in this building that you're in right now. So I highly recommend, no matter what you're interested in, looking for opportunities to really learn by doing, as Governor Graham would always say, at the Graham Center, at the Alligator, wherever it might be, because the opportunities are here and the impact it can have on others and yourself are far greater than you could possibly imagine. So go Gators, everyone.
Thank you all. Now we'll transition to our audience Q&A moderated by Lorenza Marchi.
Hi, my name is Lorenza, and I'm a fellow with the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, and I've had the honor of serving on the planning committee for tonight's event. We'll now begin the audience Q&A. Please raise your hand, and a fellow will bring a mic over to you. If you're watching the live stream, please use the chat feature on YouTube Live to ask your questions remotely.
Now it's on. Hi guys, thank you guys so much for presenting. This has been an incredibly informative panel. One thing I think that I personally struggle with, along with many other people, is you guys all had talked about like understanding what is good news versus bad news. My question is, sometimes there's just such a fast flood of information, particularly on social media, that we don't have time to sit and reflect and be like, okay, what is the good news? What is the bad news? How can I identify the rhetoric? And particularly because our algorithms are curated to us, we see something and we're just like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna take this opinion, I'm gonna run with it. So how do you guys recommend being able to tell what is that like bad news or agendaed news versus what is well-intentioned and what is honest journalism?
If I can answer that, I would, in my opinion, I feel like it's left to the eye of the beholder, I think. But I think that how to kind of differentiate between that, I think would be the style of writing. I think is very important to see if it's just opinionated or factual, and just that alone.
Yeah, I think the language is really important. It's kind of like after you've used ChatGPT, you get to recognize like the M dashes and the it's not this, it's that. Same thing with journalism. I mean, if you're seeing AOC slams Trump in this, that's, a giveaway that it's going to be a left-leaning article. Or if we're talking about Pete Hegseth destroys so-and-so in this, that they're buzzer words in the reporting. But I also think in this day and age where everything is a political issue and everything is a culture war, it is important to just, if you have a second, go on Google and see, like I know last week with the SCOTUS decision on the conversion therapy ban, I remember reading that article and I go, how is it that we have, 3 or 4 liberal justices and this was an 8-1 decision? What happened to those liberal justices? So I took a second to Google it, and that's when you realize, okay, well, the case was framed this way, and these were the merits of the argument, and this is what everybody said. I think it's important to, when you see articles like that and you see the news and you're saying, how is this possible? Or, wow, this is a really extreme statement to make or a very extreme stance to take, just go to Google and see what other people are saying, see what the other opinions are, and figure out what the different perspectives are so you can get a better understanding of where the reporter and the reporting is coming from.
For sure. I would also add that reputable news sources typically cite their sources because they would be sued if they didn't. There are a lot of independent journalists who are not held to any legal standard because they're not actually journalists, but there are libel laws that require reputable news sources to tell the truth. So you can tell when they're taking that extra step of adding their hyperlinks. That's how you cite your sources in AP style, hyperlinks instead of, the MLA like parentheses and stuff. But it's all the same practice at the end of the day, showing where those facts come from. And then I would also say that when you're seeing news on social media, I think the standard should be like not trusting what you see on social media before trusting it. For a lot of those reputable news sources that are held to libel law standards, you trust before you distrust, but the opposite for social media.
Can I bounce off that real quick?
Of course.
And to bounce off of that real quickly, I think another thing is, like you said, vetting sources. I think also just the question who, what, why, where, and how. I think it sounds really simple, but I think if you just say, if I'm reading something, did they answer all that thing, then that's informative. So that's it.
Thank you so much for those answers. And I think we have a question at the front.
Hi, thank you guys so much for being here. I mean this as like bipartisanly as possible, by the way, my question. So how does the current administration crack down on what reputable media is good and what reputable media is bad currently affect your profession, maybe in what you're citing and things like that?
I guess I can go. I'm still doing my job. I'm just telling the facts. I'm just telling two sides of the story, making sure all sides are being heard, regardless of the political aisle. So yeah.
I think that's a really great question. I think, like Andy said, distrust before you trust. As someone that pitches reporters all day, every day on political issues, I pitch what my client's story is and what their version is. I don't pitch, this is the full picture and this is what I'm advocating for. So I think when you're seeing this crackdown happen and you're hearing all of these news and you're getting one side of the aisle saying one thing and another side saying another thing, that's when it's more important for you to trust your judgment and for you to do your external research of, okay, I know what CNN is saying, I know what Fox News is saying, what is Gainesville Sun saying? What is the Oklahoma Eagle saying? What are these smaller outlets that have that different perspective saying, and where is the middle ground in all of this?
I would also add that the trends with the federal government can change the target audiences that read certain types of news. So if you're trying to reach a certain audience that proudly supports the current president, you might not want to use New York Times as much, given the current president's criticism of that platform, knowing that that audience may not trust it as much, but you'll still want to back that up with statistics. You can suspect that that's the case, but you'll want to do a poll. That's another important part of political communication we haven't talked about too much, but you want to know where people are at a large scale by doing public polling, then also qualitative analysis whenever you can, and talking to people to understand what's actually changing and how people get their news. And then that's why you might, based on what's happening federally, be like, oh, maybe we won't pitch for this audience to this source anymore.
If I can also maybe give an example of that. So I've noticed that regardless of how you feel about our current administration right now, it's affecting Florida because of whatever kind of the president would like to accomplish, the governor would also like to accomplish that as well. An example of that is Doge, I would say. How does that relate to Gainesville? Well, they were the first cities to be hit by Doge. So I went to a press conference. I even asked Ron DeSantis, what is the purpose of this? About the, basically why is this happening? And then he just basically saying we're noticing there's a lot of municipalities, President Trump has said, that are spending a lot of wasteful government spending, and we're going to the cities and looking into that. So I'm looking at Gainesville, and while we're still waiting for a report, that's something that regardless of you are against Gainesville or you love Gainesville, people want to know what's going on. And so I feel like that might, I would say, maybe to answer your question about how it's affecting from there, we're seeing that no matter where you are, there's hints of that being from there. And again, it's like what I said earlier about how is that affecting locally. And affected locally because Gainesville was one of the first cities to be hit by that from our current CFO, Blazing Golia. That's like our CFO, our state CFO. He's like the person in charge of that under his administration. So, but I would say Doge is like an example of that, I would say.
Thank you so much for those answers. Do we have another question?
Hi there. Thank you so much for coming. Kind of a similar question to Aaron's, but how do you approach projects or stories that you might disagree with just based on your personal beliefs? Or how do you take a neutral stance when you are very passionate about one of the sides? I know, Bianca, you mentioned like pitching ideas to clients. Like, I don't know if you're ever put on projects that you might not agree with these ideas, but how do you navigate this? Thank you.
That's a really great question. I remember when I was coming to Cornerstone, it's rare to hear like a bipartisan public affairs firm or like a bipartisan lobbying firm because obviously it's politics. So I was kind of concerned about how that works. But I actually found that there is, believe it or not, so much more common ground between Americans than you can begin to see. And obviously, you know, all the headlines are people love Trump, people hate Trump, this is going on, everyone hates this, everyone loves this. But I have so many colleagues, I mean, I'm talking former spokespeople for the RNC, former Trump administration officials, that when we sit down and we talk, they're really not this like evil caricature that I had made out in my mind. A lot of these people are good people with similar values to me. We just somehow ended up on different sides of the road. I think when we're talking about specifically a client and advocating for an issue that I might disagree with, I think obviously you need to know your boundaries. I have my issues that I know for sure I can never argue on the other side of. I'm first generation, I'm an immigrant. I can never write an op-ed about how immigration is awful. However, I can talk to my colleagues and understand their perspectives and where they're coming from, and that helps inform a more holistic client strategy. So if there is a client that is advocating on behalf of anti-immigration, I want to be brought into that client because I want to give my perspective and I want to give my side of the story as well. Similarly with when we're talking about, for example, we have a client that is very involved in like driverless vehicles, which scares me so bad. And it wasn't until I got to Cornerstone and I started talking to these people and they're like, no, this is actually how it works. And this is what's going on. I still would never get in them, but I am not as anti-driverless vehicle as I was before. So I think bipartisanship is a strength. I come from a country where you're not allowed to disagree with the government. And the fact that we can have that here and we can disagree with our colleagues and we can disagree with our elected officials is a privilege. So to me, being in that position is not the best, but I will never ever complain about, oh gosh, I have to defend so-and-so in this and I have to take this side. To me, that is a privilege to be able to be part of that conversation and give my perspective and better inform the client and better inform the situation.
Yeah, I also want to highlight something that Bianca said earlier, because that's a really great question. And she said that when you go into government, you usually come out more moderate, just the political sphere as a whole. And I definitely think that's true because you're seeing how the sausage gets made. And so these issues that a lot of people see as partisan in a political office, whether or not it's public relations or a campaign or an elected official, it might not be considered that partisan because you have the background, you do the research, and get a good understanding. But if someone is trying to force you to do something or advocate for something you don't believe in, then at that point it's probably time for like a conversation with those individuals, because that should never happen at a well-intentioned public relations firm or political office. Hopefully no one here finds themselves in that situation personally.
There we go. This mic, him and I are not going to agree. Could you repeat the question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, like how do you navigate, there's kind of like two questions. So if you're supposed to take a stance and you don't about one side. How do you navigate that?
Sure. So there's different types of journalism, for example. I'll give you a local example. The Gainesville Iguana is advocacy journalism. We're more informational, and I can't give you my opinion. Because if I do, I'm fired. But also at the same time, journalists are supposed to give you information, and there's been many times where obviously I'm not going to reveal what it is, but there's many things from that I go through, and I'm like, okay, but I go, all right, like I said, I feel like if, you just basically have to go who, what, why, where, and how, and kind of go, why is this coming from here, and things that are from there. Like I said, you just still do your job, and I think you just still basically weigh out all the options, and I think you just, not weigh out the options, but you hear from both sides of the story, make sure all voices are heard from there. So, yeah, I don't sound like a broken record, but I hope that answered your question. Just being unbiased reporting, I think, is just my mantra, basically.
Thank you so much for those perspectives. Do we have another question?
Hello, thank you for being here once again. I was wondering if there was anything that might have surprised you about your current role or you might have not expected before stepping into the position you're in now.
Yeah, I'll be honest. Sometimes I've created great relationships with local elected officials from both political aisles where they can call me and trust me all the time. And with that being said, it could be any time of the day. So there's been times where people have called me while I'm watching Thursday Night Football, and I'm like, all right, I'm on the clock, what's going on? And then, from there. So I would say that in a way, it's a 24/7 job. In a way, it's not like you're a nurse or a police officer, but in a way, sometimes you're like, hey, journalism doesn't sleep. So I think that's what I really learned, but I learned firsthand experience of that sometimes.
I would also add that something I didn't expect about being in public relations as an account executive is the creativity that it requires to do that role. Because a lot of people think, you're just going to be grinding on certain things, like just writing all day, whatever it might be. But I like to think of it as like you're kind of in this huge pit of sand, and you might be trying to accomplish, build X, Y, Z, different kinds of things for different clients, and you can build anything in order to get to that result, whether or not it's pitching media or digital out-of-home advertising, a fancy word for digital billboards. And there are so many different ways that you can get messages across to people. There are many different messages you can take. You can use humor, you can use sarcasm. And so at the end of the day, sometimes you're just sitting and thinking like, maybe we're not thinking about this the right way. What's a creative way that we can approach this issue? And you have infinite different ways to start on that.
I think one thing that really surprised me is just how much the little things can have a wide effect on a huge amount of the population. So I know, for example, we have a client that has an FCC issue. I have never really heard about the FCC before the Trump administration. I'm still not 100% clear on what they do. But in having this client, I'm learning a lot about how the people we see on TV get to our TV and how, the messages that we hear get to be scripted and then approved by people and then said on TV, etc. It's so interesting how every little niche of government that may seem so bureaucratic or pointless or whatever really does affect every single one of our lives. And so I really do believe like people who aren't politics people, politics affects you whether you're a political person or not. And for us, I think that's one of my joys of my job is rounding myself out and learning about the FCC, learning about gas prices, learning about tariffs, but also being part of that story to help my fellow Americans and my fellow colleagues understand that as well, and helping us be a more informed, well-rounded culture. I think it's a small role that we play. We're all little grains of sand in that, but by doing your part, it really does radiate and it really does have a bigger impact than you think it does. So I think, to me, I thought I was just going to be in client world and doing whatever the client wanted me to do, but in sharing those messages and doing that outreach and being a part of that story, it has really rippled to so many other things, which to me has been just such a joy.
Thank you so much for those answers. We have 2 questions, one on the left.
Hi, thank you all for coming. Hi, Bianca. I'm a graduating senior, and I've been thinking a lot about the transition between student and being in the workforce. And I know that you talked a lot about the skills that you guys learned at UF, but I was wondering, what transitional skills did you take from being a student to being an employee, and what was the hardest part of that transition?
For me, it was not having a nap time. And I mean that very seriously. The post-rights union MIAPA crash was a huge part of my time here. And obviously you don't get that when you're working. But I think, thankfully, because UF was so rigorous and because UF was really such a hands-on experience in what being an effective and proactive employee is, and then just really, especially in politics, getting the lay of the land. Thankfully, a lot of those transitional things weren't as difficult, and it wasn't as much of a culture clash as I thought it would be. I think just keeping in mind, like I said, what you learned here of networking and having mentors, being proactive, anticipating needs is a huge thing. I know I learned anticipating needs from packing my backpack because I never knew what textbook I needed, or like freshman year I always struggled because I got all my classes mixed up. And like something as small as like setting a calendar, seeing what classes I had, going the night before and saying, okay, what's my schedule like? What time do I have to be here? What time do I have to be there? That has helped me immensely in the workforce, and you would be surprised how many people do not have a calendar as full-time employees. But I think staying awake and not having a nap time has been the hardest. But thankfully, everything else of like being a good employee, being proactive, and being a standout were things that really instilled in me in UF. So I think all of you guys are in really, really, really great hands just by nature of being Gators.
This is kind of like me speaking as a Gator, kind of not as a journalist. Keep in touch with your professors and your mentors. Because I'll be honest, it took me a while to get a job. It sucked. But hope is important, and I think it's something that it might, like, hey, I'm not getting something after a year or two. You're like, what? Come on, I did all the right things. Why is it taking off? Like, you know, all those different things. Understand the job market from there. But from there, I would say learn the value of patience, unfortunately. I think that's just life. I think there's just some lessons that happen to you. So I would say learn that, but at the same time, keep going. I mean, I know I'm giving you like very generic advice, but like I would say really talk to your mentors a lot, because whenever like I was struggling, they're like, listen, this happened to me. This is what I did. This is what you should do. Or you know what, maybe try a different path. Maybe that didn't work. Cause I didn't do TV, but if I did radio or whatever, like, all right, like what did you do, and see where you can apply to other places. So, and maybe like, let's say you went into that one field, maybe try going to another field if that doesn't work out for you. You know, one of the reasons why I went to communications, because in case if I didn't become a journalist, I still had a writing degree from UF, and it's still, you show you're a journalist, you show you can write quickly and fastly and on time. So in a way, if you're coming from the University of Florida, and like if you come from communications, you're showing that you're an effective communicator whether you're not. So I would say keep going. Be patient and talk to your mentors.
Bouncing off of that, I'd also say that I think there's a lot for you to look forward to, because there are many ways that being a UF student is harder than working a full-time job, believe it or not. You're being prepared well by being at the Graham Center, by taking your classes. There's a lot of unpredictability about classes and exams and readings, and some of you are lucky and you'll be like, easy, preparing you for a job, perfect. But a lot of you will also be like me, where it's like, it's impossible for years. It feels really difficult to manage. And then you find that being in a 9-to-5 is actually like where you kind of belong. And you get to do that work hands-on all day, every day, instead of like reading from a book. As much as I'm sure a lot of us love reading because it's great to read, it's also fun to be able to do that hands-on. So you have a lot to look forward to for sure.
Thank you so much for those perspectives. And this will be our final question.
Perfect. Hi, I'm Eliza. So I'm a political science and public relations majors, and my professors are always talking about, as a PR professional, developing those relationships with reporters. So as someone who's becoming, who hopes to become a new PR professional, how in the beginning stage of your careers did you create those relationships without it seeming like you just wanted them for the story?
I think that's a great question. I didn't study PR when I was here. I was strictly poli-sci, so it wasn't until I started working at Sachs that I even knew what a media list was or a pitch or anything like that. For me, kind of how it started was, I know, and I'm sure Elliot can speak to this, a reporter's inbox is like an endless pit of 1.5 million different things. What I like to do was I just took a minute to see what was their previous reporting like? Can I start the email with, instead of saying like, hey, I know you covered telecom, like here's a pitch for telecom, I can be like, hey, I read your article about Brendan Carr's decision on this. I have a story for you that I think would really help you out. And once you start being a little more intentional and a little bit more targeted and building that relationship with the reporter, they can then look at you as a trusted source for whatever it is that you're pitching. They can look at you as a friend, someone that's looking out for them and not just like sending them everything that slides across your desk, and be a partner. You know, we need them, but they also need us because they can't be in every room all the time. They need somebody that can speak to XYZ expertise at XYZ story. So I think when we're talking about building relationships, it really does start with the little things of being a little more targeted, doing your research, knowing what the beat is, knowing what the previous coverage is. And that just shows respect for their time, shows respect for their craft and their art and all the hard work that they've put into their reporting. And you can go from there.
I would also add that it's a very unique relationship between a public relations or communications professional and a journalist, because there are things that you can't tell them. There are things that they know they can't tell you, but you still want to get along well, show up to your events in person to greet them if it's something that they'll be recording and getting stuff for their package while they're there in person. And remember that it's a professional relationship with them. And you can be friends and you can be friendly, but you also want to have that boundary of like kind of settling into what it's like to have like a professional friend, which is really what it is. And I think a lot of people on the journalism side, I would hope, see it the same way, that communications people, public relations people, journalists can get along really well and be friends and like kind of know where that line is, but also be there for each other, whether or not it's as a source for a story. If a journalist is like, do you know anything about this? And you're like, yeah, I actually do, that I can tell you. Or vice versa, where it's like, I wanted to tell you first that this really cool thing is happening. Do you want to be there in person and cover it?
Yeah, and sorry if I'm bouncing my head up and down like a Ed Sheeran bobblehead, but yeah, I agree with that because like, even though I've never worked for a PR firm or I'm more of a journalist than that, and obviously two different writings, but one thing I do appreciate from pitches sometimes is I really, and all of them are very understanding of like, hey, I'm like, you're talking about like, our emails being swamped, no pun intended, but like it's been very like I feel bad like saying I'm sorry we can't do this, and I feel bad that we sometimes don't have time to reach back out and say we can't do that. So what I would say sometimes is if you don't hear from us back, don't think we're a no forever. We're a no now. So and again, depends on what type of media you are. If I'm a newspaper that's a local government, I'm personally not interested in about UF athletics, but I can refer you to my other reporters that can do that as well. Also, if we're newspapers versus TV, sometimes TV does different stories than we do. Newspapers do other stories than that. So kind of like from there, I would kind of say like knowing the medium and also the publication as well. But, and I think Andy also hit the nail on the head about being professional friends and boundaries, because it's, because you talk a lot of people and it's very casual to come up on conversations, be friendly, but sometimes you have to go, okay, how to I think boundaries are important while still, being friendly and still having a good relationship. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you so much. This concludes our Navigating Political Media panel. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for all of your insight, and thank you to the Bob Graham Center staff and student fellows for your help in supporting this event. We invite all of you for a reception upstairs with some light refreshments to continue engaging with our panelists. Thank you all.